Hi, I'm Tom Gilson, Associate Editor with Against the Grain, and I'm here at the Charleston Conference in the penthouse suites in the Francis Marion Hotel, and I'm here with Jack Montgomery from Western Kentucky University. He's the Collection Development Librarian there. I'm also joined by Albert Joy, who is in Acquisitions and Preservations at the University of Vermont, and we're here to talk to Peter Binfield, who is the publisher of PeerJ. Peter, welcome to the penthouse.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
It's a delight to have you here. I guess one of our first questions, you made quite an impact with PLOS One, and we were wondering what prompted you to leave PLOS One and start PeerJ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and PLOS One was a fabulous place to work. I worked there for 4 years in the end, and grew it obviously to be the largest journal in the world. Very exciting, but at the same time, it was a very large journal within the PLOS ecosystem, and you really couldn't take many experiments with it. So it's an important journal for the viability of PLOS, and there wasn't much opportunity really to experiment with new ways of doing things, new models, even new functionality. It was quite hard to implement on it. So at some level there was perhaps an inability to break out and do something innovative and dynamic within the PLOS One environment, but also, I've always wanted to start my own company. I've always wanted to break out and give it a try. Be your own boss.
I see. So the entrepreneurial spirit.
Exactly. I've always wanted that, and I'm sort of just about young enough that I can I can get away with it and take a risk with my my family's future. And then I guess finally, I mean, Jason Hoyt, my co-founder, came to me with this idea, and it was just a very attractive proposition, a very attractive business model, and I thought there's a real chance for success.
Well, then what are your plans for PeerJ? I mean, what are you going to be doing, and how is it going to go? How's it going to work?
So PeerJ, at the moment, we announced our existence in June, and we've been spending perhaps the last 6 months building up the editorial board, building the software, the submission platform, the peer review platform, and everything. We're right now at the point where we have about 750 academic editors on the journal, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, a lot of very senior, respectable academics on the board. And we're actually receiving beta submissions from those board members right now. So for the last week now, academic editors have been submitting papers into the peer review system for us to test out the bugs and take papers through the process. We're probably going to open for public submissions round about the 1st of December. At the moment, it's the plan. And then depending on how fast those articles pass through the system, we'll be publishing our first articles in January, something like that, January, February, depending on how fast they move for peer review and production.
I see.
So that's PeerJ, the journal, and that journal is, it's a journal not dissimilar to PLOS One. It's a mega journal. It covers the whole of biomedical and medical sciences. It has peer review criteria that are based on the soundness of the science, not the impact. Those kind of measures. But then, in addition to the journal itself, we have a preprint server that we're going to be launching at the same time, which is PeerJ Preprints. So effectively, we'll have 2 publications, a journal and a preprint server. The 2 will be quite closely integrated with each other, so you can, for example, as an author, submit into the preprint server, and that article can be transferred across, as it were, into the journal for real peer review. Once an article is published in the journal, you'll be able to publish, as it were, the prior versions of that paper, the peer review audit trail almost, the revisions in the preprint server. So the 2 together act as a quite nice little publishing ecosystem, and that should launch around the same time.
Well, it sounds like you'll be able to almost trace the genealogy of a paper.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's what we tried to do with this, actually. What you tend to see, I think, with just a journal publication is that's only a small slice of the publication event for an academic. An academic typically writes a draft, sends it around their peer group, gets revisions, works that up into a real submission to a journal. It goes to a journal, there's peer review again, there's more revisions, and finally it sort of out pops the finished version. In a traditional journal, all you ever see is the finished version. You don't see all of the makings of the sausage beforehand. You don't see the peer review comments, the prior revisions, and obviously the physicists have had their preprint servers archive, which have worked quite well for them. But this kind of this concept of having a preprint server attached to a journal hasn't really worked in the biosciences in the past. Hasn't really been tried in general, actually closely tying a preprint server to a journal, so you can really track the history all the way through. historically, there's been a preprint server, and that's been a standalone, separate entity, the archive.
Right.
And then people put papers in there, and then end up submitting them to a totally separate journal. So we think it could be quite a nice offering to an author to be able to actually sort of track their paper through the entire revision and creation process. Yeah.
Do you think that your preprint server will take the place of or enhance the prior procedure of sending your draft around to your colleagues, and how would you encourage that in the community of scholars?
So we certainly hope that it's going to be, as it were, a more effective way for people to get that sort of pre-submission, pre-print feedback from their colleagues, and so the preprint server will actually have several levels of permissions, as it were, that an author can apply. So when an author submits a preprint, they'll be able to select, a box that say just share it with this select group of colleagues, share it with the wider world, just share parts of the article, just share the title or the abstract or the full article, so that they'll be able to have quite a bit of control over what can be shared and to whom, which we hope will facilitate people actually coming into the paper, commenting either privately or publicly in the preprint environment, and really working up a good draft there. Yeah.
Will there be ways for authors to identify interesting constituencies outside of their usual circle through that approach?
There will eventually, of course, at some point we'll have built up a database of authors, co-authors, members, reviewers, and so on, and we'll know something about them. We'll know the papers they authored or reviewed, and therefore what their expertise was, and so at some stage we'll have quite a nice database that somebody, as you mentioned, might be able to just say, well, suggest possible colleagues to me from your database. But obviously initially we won't have that because we don't have the database, but definitely that's something that's expected down the line.
I think that would be quite a value add.
Yes, exactly.
To it.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, does PeerJ offer article level metrics?
Yes, it will. So I was actually one of the pioneers of article level metrics at PLOS One, so it's a subject very dear to my heart, and I'm actually talking later this afternoon about article level metrics. So yes, we will. Although the platform isn't yet built, so there's no article level metrics to look at today, but certainly we'll definitely be displaying things like the usage, the citations, presumably some of the social media metrics as well. It's a field that's really dynamic right now, this sort of alt-metrics movement, and people in that group are still trying to figure out what are the most important sort of article level metrics to put on an article.
What would your opinion be about that?
It's it is interesting. I think there's different metrics for different purposes. So as it were, the gold standard of a metric is the citation. It's a scholarly citation from a known scholar, in an academic journal, and that's obviously been the historical sort of measure of quality, and so that's an obvious, easy one to put at the top of the list. I think next is downloads. Usage is important, I think, but then you get into nuances. So if you provide both the HTML and the PDF version of a paper, is it actually more important to have a high number of PDF downloads, for example, because that implies that somebody has actually taken the time to download it and will therefore really read it? Whereas an HTML view might just be they skimmed through it and just looked at one paragraph and moved on. So there's some work to be done, I think, by the movement to decide what is an important download metric, but I think they are important in some way. And then you get into sort of the social media areas, Facebook likes, tweets, those kind of things, social bookmarks in services like SiteYouLike and Mendeley. So I think there what becomes interesting is the network of the people. So it's not perhaps so important to know how many tweets there were, how many Facebook likes, but actually who were the people tweeting and who were the people liking or who were the people bookmarking. Because if a senior academic in the field is tweeting about a paper, that means more than perhaps a more junior academic, and that I think is a whole field that hasn't been explored yet. At the moment, the sort of alt-metrics movement is just counting numbers. They're not really assigning, I guess, status to the each number depending on where it came from.
Is there a privacy issue involved in capturing who tweeted?
Not so much, because they are making these things public by default. So when you tweet, it's public who you are. When you Facebook like, it's public who you are. What perhaps is more of a privacy issue is things like the usage, actually. So when you download or view an HTML paper, we know who that user was. We know the IP address, at least, of their computer. but that user doesn't expect their browsing history to be made public, and so you wouldn't do that, of course. But perhaps you can report on trends or something. I don't know. This paper was predominantly read by academics at Harvard or something like that. Perhaps you can be at least that open.
Peter, the standard model for open access is a paying per paper, and you all have a different model. You have a membership model.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's probably the most interesting visible thing about PeerJ that's perhaps got us a lot of attention. So you're right. The typical sort of gold open access business model is the APC, article processing charge, where an author pays a certain amount of money, roughly $1,000, to publish the paper. There are other models, of course. There's entirely free, for example, like eLife, where it's been entirely sponsored by somebody, and then for authors it's free to submit and publish. So what we felt, I think, when we were sort of putting together PeerJ is that really there are only those two business models being applied in the open access world. There's not been a lot of experimentation with different business models to pay for the act of open access publishing, and so the membership model to us was attractive from that point of view. First of all, it is an interesting experiment. It tries something new in the open access space that may or may not be successful. But secondly, I think it's attractive for other reasons. It brings it down to an individual co-author. So the model is that every co-author on a paper, every author and co-author on a paper has to be a paying member of PeerJ by the time of publication in order to publish the paper. And they can pay at 3 levels at the moment. We have $99, which is a lifetime membership fee, which allows them to publish 1 paper per year for life, for that $99. $199 allows them to publish 2 papers a year, and $299 is the all-you-can-eat model. It's you publish unlimited number of papers per year for life for that $299, but that's per individual. So if there's 5 co-authors on a paper, all 5 of them have to have bought some membership level and have the credit, as it were, to be able to make that publication that year. But it's an interesting model, and it remains to be seen whether it's going to confuse the market or be a benefit to the market. It's not been tried before, so I think we're going to have a job of I guess marketing it, explaining what this model is to people. When you're a random co-author on a paper and suddenly you get this email come in say, "Oh, thanks for being a co-author. Now you have to become a member in order for the entire paper to be published."
And by the way, you owe us.
Yes, or you will owe us at some point before publication. So I think there's going to be a messaging thing to work out as people understand and start to use this.
I did notice though on the website there's a free membership. What's that about?
So free membership is actually, if you're a free member, you can submit a PeerJ preprint, for instance. So also it just puts you on our mailing list, of course, but you can be a free member and then you can upgrade from one level to the other, as it were. So free membership is just the base. If you want to be in the database, if you want to comment, for instance, you're going to need to be a member. Comments, for example, will be tied to a profile and those kind of reasons. Yeah.
Peter, according to your website, PeerJ aims to drive down the publishing costs. And what strategies are you doing to employ that?
Yeah, and this is an important point, I think. So with this model that I just described, the revenue that we get from that model is much lower than a typical APC charge, which is in the range of $1,000, $2,000, and plus one, for instance, is $1,350. But you can see straight away that we'll get less money per paper, and so we believe that we can do that because we've got an idea of how to basically automate the system better, how to make it more efficient. For instance, we're building our own software entirely from start to finish. So we've built our own peer review system, building our own platform, so we can control that software environment much better than a typical publisher might be that might go for a third-party solution for its peer review, a third-party solution for its publication. So first of all, the fact that we sort of own and control our own software is important, I think. Also the fact that from my experience with PLOS ONE, I know how to run a journal at a great scale. PLOS ONE is now receiving 4,000 submissions a month. So from my experience of that, I've got a very good idea of how to set up that system in the most efficient and effective way, which again is going to drive down the costs, needing less manual intervention from staff, for instance. But at the end of the day, this isn't the full service publication that something like Nature or Science or eLife would do. The papers are not going to be copy edited in a detailed way. They're going to be typeset and published as a very attractive PDF, but there won't be any copy editing involved, for example. We're not going to be paying our academic editors, for example. There's various places in the system that we can make the process more efficient and cost effective to allow us to operate on our lower revenue. But then what you're also referring to, I think, is a statement on the website that actually this business model is not the end. We actually want to take that cost lower. The $99 should drive towards zero, basically. And so that at the moment this business model is enough to cover the costs and sustain the enterprise at the moment. But down the line we expect to be able to come up with perhaps new revenue models, new ways of monetizing this stuff, so that actually the cost for the authors can go down effectively to zero. I mean, the ultimate sort of nirvana here is that it's free to submit and free to publish and free to read. It's not just you pay to publish and free to read. We want to make the whole system free, and pay for the cost in some other way.
Where would you see that funding, the necessary funding, coming from then, if not from the institution or the institution, which would include the authors?
I think there's going to be probably a variety of revenue streams that can sort of fill the gap that don't necessarily involve charging the individual authors. There are other people in the process that could be charged. Speaking in the most general sense, advertising is the obvious one, for instance. So there you're charging advertisers rather than authors. There's also data analytics, for instance, wrapped around the system. For instance, what if you do have very good knowledge of what is the hottest paper in the field, and then perhaps that's interesting for a pharma company, for example. So perhaps there's data analytics that you can wrap around it and charge people there. Again, which would not be the authors being charged; it would be a pharma company in that example. Perhaps there's sophisticated alerting functionality that people would buy an upgrade for instance. So that obviously there'll be regular alerting built into the system, email, TOC alerts, but what if you could pay an upgrade and get some sort of sophisticated alert, sort of in real time of some sort? So we don't actually know exactly the menu of options. At the moment we're very busy just launching it with the model we've got. But our end vision, our ultimate goal is to try and make this even cheaper than it currently is, actually.
I applaud that. As an acquisitions librarian, working with the cost and viewing the cost to an institution for the public access titles, as in PLOS, there still is a cost. It just shifts away from, let's say, the library's traditional budget to the author's, to the professor's budget, and there still is a cost for that institution in some fashion. So I think this is a very interesting endeavor.
And really, the possibilities are almost endless of where you could try and shift those costs to, actually. And I think the important thing is to get the costs low enough such that these other revenue streams, which are always going to be, I think, less than a subscription model or even a high APC fee. You're always going to generate less money with the examples I just listed. So the costs need to be low to start with.
Peter, in terms of, here's sort of the obligatory question, because it's a library conference. Where do you see, or how do you envision a role for a library in PeerJ's future? What is it we can do to help you advance your vision for PeerJ?
Actually, there's sort of two questions in your question there. What can you do to help us was the sort of second part. And for example, libraries could choose to prepay memberships for all of their faculty, for example. So an individual membership could be $99, and let's say you have 100 faculty. You might choose to reserve whatever $10,000 from your budget to buy that membership for those faculty, and perhaps you hand a free membership to every postdoc that joins. Here's your office, and here's your membership at PeerJ. You can now publish for free. So you could choose to do that, although that's really just shifting your budget around, and probably that's not so attractive to an academic library. But we do have that facility, and we've been approached by people already to do exactly what I just described. Basically, either pre-buy memberships for authors or prepay in a sort of a debit account, and then as authors from their institution come to us, they get a little warning on the screen saying, your library has already got a prepaid account with us. Do you want to take the $99 from your library's budget, as it were, that they've prepaid, or do you want to pay yourself? So we've had quite a few contacts already from libraries around the world to do exactly that. So that's sort of how you can help us, in addition to just publicising the existence in the world.
Can I follow on that for a minute? Would you speak maybe not to the libraries, but to officers of research in the administration, deans of graduate schools, as another avenue for that funding, rather than the library? Because libraries haven't traditionally supported so directly
Not so
scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, libraries historically in the open access world have sometimes paid a membership fee, as it were, for Biomed Central or PLOS, which then gets them some sort of their author some sort of discount off of the publication. So what I was describing wasn't that; it was more of an actual payment. But you're right; there are other groups in the university world that could pay this, although I think they're harder to reach. It's not like we have a sales force or anything like that. These people are even more removed from the problem of payment for publication than a librarian is, for instance. So reaching them, convincing them that it's a good idea to divert some of their funds into something like this, it's going to be hard, I think. But I wanted to get back to the sort of the first half of your question, was where do I see a role for libraries in the future of PeerJ? And that's almost like a bigger question. Where do I see a role for libraries in the future of open access? And I'm a big advocate of open access, of course, and I'm sort of on record that I think it's the disruptive business model that is going to dominate the industry pretty soon. In roughly 5 years' time, I think open access will form a majority of published content. And at that point, I think that then there's an interesting role for libraries when as it were, the subscription model dies at some point, and then there's no longer a need for libraries to worry about subscribing to journals and dealing with big deals and everything. And now they're in an open access world where perhaps the funds are coming directly from authors, not via libraries, and that point I think is interesting, because then libraries can almost get back to their original purpose, which is to be sort of information specialists, to be curators, and to be people who can filter the content and point their patrons to the most, I guess, authoritative sources for research, to provide filtering mechanisms on top of this sort of ocean of open access content. And I think that's an interesting future for libraries, sort of once everything becomes open access.
What impact do you think, and maybe the librarians can reference this, collecting development librarian in particular, what impact do you think that will have on libraries' collection development if we're not developing collections and journal collections through subscriptions?
Are you asking me?
I'm actually just throwing it out to the table.
I think the role of librarians, whether they're, as you're saying, are navigators. If we think in terms of non-physical collections, but collections much wider than the walls of the library, a collection development librarian, or for that matter, a reference or an instruction librarian, is going to be pointing to, as you said, the information resources germane to the question at hand, or the subject at hand. I'm not so worried about what will happen to policies or roles, because the roles are not changing. Maybe the location of the resources change, but the role is still the same. How do you answer the question?
And that puts librarians, all of us, in the role of being, in a sense, research associates for both students and faculty in trying to locate materials.
And I think in terms of procurement, as I always tell my staff now, don't think of it beyond that we're buying content. And when we buy content, that's what we're looking for. Content is what is needed, not format. And that if we have to put $10,000 to get the science faculty a membership in PeerJ, and that opens up a whole level of intellectual dialogue between the library and them, then we've certainly benefited from that investment.
Yes. I'm mostly concerned about the costs to the institution. That's why PeerJ is, I think, a step ahead of open access, because open access, whether it's memberships or authors' fees, can be just assumed as a cost shift from the traditional library budget to an institutional burden. If authors have to pay expensive, if they want to publish multiple articles in a year, whose responsibility?
Yes.
And it's not new that their author page charges and similar things, even in the subscription model. Sure. But I'm very cautious about the overall cost whether it's an open access journal or whether it's a subscription model. It's just a question of where that cost is being borne.
And in defining the limitations of that cost, you know, so that we do not buy into something that keeps growing and we find ourselves unable to manage. That's something I deal with almost on a weekly basis.
So the PeerJ approach is very intriguing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing as well is it's a low amount of money. You know, we do expect a lot of academics to just actually pay this out of their personal credit card almost at $99. That's a nice meal out. You know, it's not like $1,000 where actually that's a real purchase for them and they want to put a purchase order through the university system and everything. You know, at the level of $99, conceivably just individuals will pay themselves, which again sort of takes the burden away from the system.
Yes.
That kind of brings me back to this notion as we talk about all this PeerJ and open access. One of the concerns that I hear is this notion of peer review. Obviously, peer review is a keystone in the academic world, and there are questions about how open access is going to handle peer review and ensure the same level of peer review that we currently have in the subscription model. And I was wondering how PeerJ is going to address that.
Yeah, and PeerJ is fully peer reviewed. So the model again is very similar to PLOS One. So when a paper comes in, it'll be assigned to one of the academic editors, and that academic editor is then responsible for going out and finding a minimum of 2 external peer reviewers who then comment on the article, and then the academic editor makes a decision based on the peer review comments. What I think is interesting about PeerJ and some other open access publishers is the concept of open peer review. So that, you know, what I just described is quite a traditional process of peer review operated by, you know, journals for hundreds of years, or perhaps not hundreds, but you know, what we think we can do additionally, and this is not pioneered by PeerJ, but we can actually make those peer review comments and the audit trail open. So there's actually 2 elements to open peer review. The first is that the name of the peer reviewers is made sort of open to the authors. So normally that peer review event is an anonymous peer reviewer. One element of open peer review is actually to name the peer reviewer that's reviewing on the article. And then the other element to open peer review is to then take all the peer review comments that were submitted with the paper and all the revisions and the rebuttal letter and everything, and publish those alongside the final published article. So that then forms an audit trail of the peer review process. So somebody can go back and forensically look at, well, did this article actually have an appropriate peer review process? Was the right decision made? So we're going to be encouraging both those elements of open peer review. At the moment, it's going to be an optional encouragement rather than a requirement, because this is, you know, a somewhat new concept for a lot of people, and we don't want to dissuade people. But I think with our system as well, the fact that we know who the individuals are, if they do choose to make their name known as part of the peer review process, then they can get credit for having done that peer review. So you'll be able to go to their profile page and it'll say, this person has been the peer reviewer on these 5 articles, and they start to build up status, you know, in a sort of very sort of network-driven way, which is quite nice. So we think that will just naturally encourage people to provide their name.
So each of your members will have a profile on
if they choose. So to be a peer reviewer, again, you have to be you have to have an account in the system, as with any journal that uses an online peer review system. To be a peer reviewer, you have to submit it in the online system, so you have to have some sort of account. For us, the account is the free membership, basically. So the peer reviewer comes in, and, you know, they only have to give a basic amount of information in order to submit a peer review. We're not trying to twist their arm to become a paying member or anything. So they provide their name and email, basically. But that then creates an account for them in the system, and they can choose to build that up and have a public profile. They can tick a box saying, I want my profile to be public, and then they can fill in a lot more information, their biography, their photo, their you know, resume of published papers, links to their Google Scholar profile, that kind of thing. And then if they've done that, then and as they make each peer review, they've ticked the same box that says, you know, I want my name to be known, then the name gets associated with that profile and that review. And again, you know, in the initial months and years, you know, perhaps you won't see much of an effect there because the volumes are quite low, and any given peer reviewer might have only reviewed 1 paper for us. But I think as the database builds up, as we publish more and more, you'll start to see the power of being able to do that with the reviewers, the authors, the commenters, and so on.
You're also facilitating the development of community.
Yes, exactly.
And that one too strikes me as being a real positive.
Yeah, yeah.
As well as prestige and reputation.
Exactly.
I was the peer reviewer on this major paper.
Yeah, that's exactly
I think
it.
there's a certain reward system that's important in academia, and I think that would be another facet of it.
And potentially, this could be one of the solutions to the commenting problem. So comments on published papers have been a somewhat dismal failure for most people who've tried it. And there's various reasons, I think, why people don't comment on papers, but perhaps one way we can encourage them is actually to give them credit for their comments. If they're the most well-respected commenter, they get the most thumbs up for their comments, they rise to the top of the leaderboard or something like that. So, and again, none of this is built yet. It's all just the potential of our system where we will actually know who each person is in the process. A typical journal, even an APC open access journal like PLOS ONE, usually only cares who the corresponding author is, within their database. They know who the corresponding author is because that's the person that submits the paper and is ultimately going to pay the bill. But typically the system and the publisher actually doesn't care who the co-authors are, except insofar as to list their name on the published paper. But because we care about each individual and we'll know who each one is, I think we'll have a better database of metadata around all the interactions, basically.
One of the ongoing issues is the preservation archiving of digital journals. How do you envision PeerJ addressing that?
Yeah, and in many respects, PeerJ is a traditional journal. So we say in various places what we're trying to do is take the best elements of the journal publishing process that's built up over 300 years and marry them up to the best elements of modern web design and database design and so on. So I'm a career publisher. I've been publishing for 20 years. So preservation is very important. A version of record is an immutable version of record. It's an extremely important concept. So we're doing all the right things basically in response to your question. So it will be fully archived. In addition to our own archiving, and we're using actually Amazon services. So our own servers and content are archived via Amazon, which is 6 nines reliability or whatever it is. But then in addition, obviously, we'll be depositing in PubMed Central as an open access journal. So PubMed Central forms an archive straight away. They're backed up. We're actually a member of CLOCKS. We're a paying member of CLOCKS, which is one of the primary archiving solutions. And so we'll be archiving everything with CLOCKS as well. And the extra one that we want to do is actually we'd like to be archived at the Royal Dutch Library. But right now they're not actually taking new publications for their archiving solution. I think they're in some period of sort of retrenchment and deciding what the ultimate business model is. But at the moment, at the very least, our own archiving, PubMed Central and CLOCKS is already sort of industry standard level archiving, and we'd like to add that one extra one of Royal Dutch Library as well. And then in addition, just the concept with open access is that actually there's a distributed archive, because anyone can download this content and basically archive it on their hard disk. There are copies out there everywhere, even in the event of the implosion of the internet, various people might have downloaded the database. We already hear on PLOS ONE actually that there are people out there that are quite proud of the fact that they've downloaded the entire PLOS archive, all the articles which you can do via the PLOS API, put it on a memory stick, and they just carry it around with them. In event of nuclear emergency, open this memory stick. But that's entirely possible with an open access publication, which isn't possible, obviously, with a more restricted license publication.
You've presented here at the conference, and I think according to what I have here, the title was Zen in the Art of Scholarly Publishing Business Models.
Yes.
Were there any other viable business models that you heard people talk about at the presentation?
So that was, there was a presentation, this was yesterday, and it was with Eric Moran of Sage, they have the Sage Open Journal, Kristen Rattan-Fisher, who's at PLOS, and now in charge of the editorial group at PLOS, myself, and then Biomed Central were there as well, actually. So most of the business models being discussed were actually open access business models, which it wasn't necessarily, I think, intended to be a panel about open access business models, but because of the constituents, it just ended up that way. But obviously, there are other viable business models. There are ones that have already been successful. The APC model, of course. There's eLife that actually wasn't discussed yesterday, but eLife is an interesting business model. Again, it's not really a business model. In fact, it's been entirely funded by a group of wealthy, research funders to make everything in the process free. But I think what was interesting, which perhaps came out more in the question and answer session at the end rather than the presentations, was the question of business models for other types of publication, for instance, books, and not just books, but open access books. What is the business model for that? And I think that's an area that people don't have an answer for at the moment. What is a business model that works in the humanities and social sciences, where they have no research grants to spend $1,000 on APC, and PeerJ won't be publishing in those areas. We're concentrating on biomedical and medical. So what is a business model that might work for those areas? So that was more in the Q&A really, and I wouldn't say anybody had any great answers to it particularly.
It's still up in the air to be decided.
Exactly, yeah. One thing at a time. Yeah.
I guess to finish up, do you guys have any other additional questions? We did this to Eric Hellman earlier when we spoke to him, and we're going to do it to you too. If you were sitting in our chairs and you had the opportunity to ask you a question, what would that question be?
I think, well, I mean, because of my background at PLOS One, which is this very large journal, doubling in size every year, very disruptive, and so I guess my viewpoint on the cutting edge of where open access is going, I think the question would be, and we may have answered it already, but where do you see this all going? Where is the open access world going to go, and what are the consequences of that? If everything is published in PLOS One, in a mega journal, rather than in the current ecosystem of 25,000 journals, what does that actually mean, to the ecosystem? So I think I would ask a question like that, and whether or not I've got a good answer is another matter. But I guess you would like me to answer my question.
now that you've brought it up.
So it's interesting. So PLOS One, when I was embedded within it, it was my world, and it's doubling in size every year. I mean, literally last month it received 4,000 submissions. It's publishing probably this year about 27,000 articles. So this year PLOS One will probably publish about 3% of all the articles in PubMed. PubMed indexes about 1 million articles a year, and it's still doubling. I mean, I've seen that growth historically for 4 years, and it's an inexorable growth. And then what that caused, of course, is a lot of people to wake up and take notice and launch PLOS One clones. So that there's been a rash of maybe 20 PLOS One clones that have launched, of which really, honestly, PeerJ is could be put in that category. It's a PLOS One clone in the sense that the peer review criteria are very similar, and it wants to be a very large journal covering a very large area. And so we always thought that was a very good thing within PLOS. Obviously the model is a success. Other people are seeing it's a success. The more sort of mega journal PLOS One clones that exist, the better. The faster everything moves. But what has been interesting, I think, is that those clones haven't succeeded. If you look at their output, it's very low. Even the most successful PLOS One clone, which is probably Nature's Scientific Reports, hasn't been as successful as PLOS One was in the equivalent early years of its history. And so that's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily healthy if you have a monoculture of one very massive journal and it keeps doubling every year, and it does end up publishing everything. It would be nice to have an ecosystem of 100 PLOS One clones, all publishing 1% of the literature, for example. And at the moment, I think, from the author's point of view, if you want the PLOS One experience, why would you go anywhere other than PLOS One? They're all effectively Me Too publications. They have a very similar APC price. They're all clustered at the 1350 mark. They all have a similar peer review system. They're all APC based. They're all in a large subject area. So as an author, why not just go to PLOS One? PLOS One has a brand. It's established. You know what you're going to get. You can see how fast it makes its decisions. It has an impact factor, which is still very important to a lot of people, but very irrelevant to PLOS One itself. So I think what is interesting there from PeerJ's point of view is that we think we do have a differentiator in the market. We think we will actually be able to differentiate ourselves in the mind of an author, particularly because of this sort of membership business model and the much lower price. But yeah, so if PLOS One is doubling in size every year and the competition isn't really picking up to pick up the slack, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I think the clones will start to pick up in the future, and we do see evidence of them starting to become more popular. But they certainly haven't grown as fast as we thought and hoped that they would. But still, so with that put aside, I still think that the growth of open access is now very clear. There was a paper published just a couple of weeks ago with the latest data on number of articles that are being published open access. And there's been a very nice paper by David Lewis published, which was The Inevitability of Open Access, which I think he published in ACRL. And for that paper, he published it over a year ago now, but he took Clay Christensen's theory of disruption of a market. That there's actual sort of a formula you can apply to the percentage growth of a disruptor compared to the marketplace. And he projected forward to see, at what point does open access actually, become the dominant business model. And when he published that back in the day, a year or so ago, the most aggressive sort of projection was by 2017, 50% of all content would be open access articles. 50% of all articles being published will be open access, and then the curve has done that at that point. It's almost exponential, and everything follows a couple of years later. And I think what's interesting is the most recent data that was published by Bjork, Christensen, Bjork, Laxo and Bjork, that's it, published just 2 weeks ago at Open Access Week. That actually puts the curve even more aggressive. Yeah. So their latest data is actually on the more aggressive end of that aggressive curve. So, and it's something that I've seen as well, just with the doubling of PLOS One. I see open access becoming the dominant mode of journal article publications very quickly. Within 5 years, I can fully expect that 50% number to have happened. And yeah, and then what does that mean again? This is all sort of crystal ball gazing, isn't it? But if that happens, then again, an entire ecosystem of subscription journals have gone out of business. And what does that mean to the world?
Is that growth through new publication, or is it from new researchers, for instance, from Asia, or is it from to the people's existing authors moving from the subscription model journals to the open access journals?
There's an element of everything. I think it's an expanding bubble within an expanding universe, definitely. But I think the universe isn't growing as fast as the bubble within it is. So I don't think what I don't see evidence of is sort of new publications being created that wouldn't have been published otherwise. So we often had that question at PLOS One: is the stuff you're publishing, as it were, cannibalizing from other journals, or is it new stuff that would never have been published? And we did some analyses. We actually looked at the papers, and we had our editors actually delve into them and take a decision on each one. And as far as we could see, the vast majority of the content, well over 95%, was stuff that would have been submitted somewhere else, would have been published somewhere else. There was only a tiny sliver that perhaps was, approaching the minimum publishing unit that perhaps would not have found a publishing home previously. So I think there's definitely an element of people who would have published their content in a subscription journal are now coming to the open access world. And obviously things like the mandates from institutions and governments are driving that as well. But what is also interesting, I think, is that because the proportion of open access is currently quite low, even with this latest data that I mentioned, it's still only 14% of all articles are being published in a sort of pure gold OA environment. I don't think it's a high enough proportion yet to have shown an effect at the subscription journal sort of side of the fence. That those people are not hurting at the moment for submissions because all they potentially lost is roughly 10 or 14% of their submissions, which is a blip. So and PLOS One similarly, PLOS One this year will publish 27,000 articles roughly, and there's 25,000 journals in the world. So on average, PLOS One has only taken one article away from each journal, on average. So I think again, what is happening is I think that trend is happening. It's not necessarily being noticed yet, and it won't be noticed until it's too late when the curve has done this, and then you're too late. So people need to pay attention to the early indicators of this trend. I think.
Well, I guess Peter, thank you so much. We have really enjoyed it. We've learned a lot, and it's been fun.
Thank you very much.